You've been lied to, not by a person, not by a book, but by the most seductive idea in modern spirituality that thinking differently is enough to change who you are. Every day, millions of people consume content about raising their vibration, shifting their energy, manifesting abundance, and aligning with higher consciousness. They feel inspired for hours, sometimes days. They journal beautiful thoughts. They repeat affirmations in the mirror. They watch another video about the law of attraction. And then, almost invisibly, they return to exactly the same patterns, the same reactions, the same life. Not because they lack intelligence or sincerity, but because they've been practicing the wrong thing entirely. Here's a question that might unsettle you. What if the most profound spiritual traditions in human history never actually taught that transformation happens in the mind? What if every genuine school of inner development, from the Vedic rishis to the Sufi orders, from the Christian desert fathers to the Zen monasteries, from the Hermetic mystery schools to the work of G.I. Gurdjieff, place something else entirely at the center of their practice? Not thoughts, not beliefs, not feelings, but disciplined, repeated, embodied action. The body, it turns out, is not a vehicle for the spirit, it is the laboratory where the spirit is forged. And there's a specific convergence happening right now, quietly, at the intersection of ancient asceticism and modern behavioral science, that reveals why habits, particularly physical and embodied ones, carry a transformative power that no idea, no matter how brilliant, ever can. The term atomic habits, made popular by James Clear's landmark book, points at something the ancient traditions knew for millennia, that change doesn't happen through insight alone, but through the accumulated gravity of tiny, consistent actions, each one seemingly insignificant, yet collectively capable of reshaping the very architecture of a human being. We're going to trace that thread today, from the ashrams of ancient India to the bizarre physical disciplines of Gurdjieff's Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, from the neurological mechanics of habit formation to the esoteric understanding of why the body must be trained before the mind can be freed. First, we'll examine why mental spirituality, as beautiful as it is, systematically fails at the level of real transformation. Then, we will explore what the great traditions actually prescribed when they wanted to change a human being at the root. And finally, we will arrive at a synthesis that answers a question most people never even think to ask. If you truly wanted to transform, not just think about transformation, where would you actually begin? So here's the thread to hold as we go deeper. If genuine change requires something more than thought, and every tradition that actually produced transformed human beings knew this, then what exactly were they doing that we've forgotten? Picture a river. Now picture someone standing on the bank reading books about swimming, watching videos about swimming, thinking deeply and sincerely about what it feels like to swim, visualizing themselves moving through the water with grace and power. They understand the theory of buoyancy. They've memorized the mechanics of the freestyle stroke. They feel genuinely inspired by the possibility of swimming. And yet, the moment they step into the water, they sink. This is the condition of most modern spiritual seekers. There is nothing wrong with the river. There is nothing wrong with the person. The problem is a category error, a fundamental confusion between two things that feel similar but operate on entirely different levels: the experience of understanding an idea and the experience of being transformed by a practice. One happens in the neocortex, in the theater of conscious thought, where everything is fast, fluid, and ultimately disposable. The other happens in the body, in the nervous system, in the deep grooves of repeated action that neuroscience now calls procedural memory, and that the ancients simply called discipline. Here's what the mainstream personal development world consistently gets wrong. It treats transformation as an information problem, as if the reason you're not living the life you want is because you haven't yet heard the right idea, the right reframe, the right affirmation. So it keeps producing more content, more insights, more inspiration, and people keep consuming it, feeling that familiar surge of possibility, that warm sense of expansion, and then returning almost mechanically to the same behavioral patterns they've always had. Because those patterns don't live in the mind, they live in the body, they live in the nervous system. They live in the habituated grooves of repeated physical and emotional response that have been carved over years, sometimes decades, of consistent unconscious repetition. What if the problem isn't that people lack good ideas? What if the problem is that they've been trying to renovate a house by repainting the walls while the foundation remains untouched? The Vedic tradition has a concept called samskara, which refers to the deep impressions left on the subtle body by repeated actions and experiences. These impressions are not metaphors, they are functional grooves in the psyche, in the nervous system, in the body itself that create automatic tendencies, automatic reactions, automatic ways of being in the world. The only thing that transforms a samskara is not a new thought about it, but a new practice, repeated with sufficient consistency and intensity to carve a different groove. The tradition was very precise about this. Insight is the beginning of the path, not the destination. Carl Jung, operating within a completely different framework, arrived at a strikingly similar conclusion. He observed that psychological transformation, genuine individuation, never happened through intellectual understanding alone. It required what he called the work, which always involved engagement with the unconscious through embodied practices, active imagination, ritual, creative expression, and most importantly, through the patient, repeated confrontation with the same patterns until something in the psyche genuinely shifted. You are what you do, Jung essentially argued, not what you think you do. And this is exactly where atomic habits enter the picture, not as a self-help technique, but as a rediscovery of something ancient dressed in the language of behavioral science. James Clear's central insight that identity change precedes behavioral change and that identity is built through the accumulation of small consistent actions is structurally identical to what every serious spiritual tradition has always taught. You don't think your way into a new self. You practice your way into one. But here's what makes this deeper than it first appears. The traditions weren't just talking about building good routines. They were describing a specific mechanism, a precise relationship between the body, the nervous system, the will, and what they variously call the soul, the higher self, or the essential nature of a human being. The body, trained through consistent practice, creates a different kind of consciousness, not just a better mood or more productive morning, a fundamentally different quality of presence, attention, and being in the world. The question then becomes, what exactly did these traditions know about the mechanics of this process that we've either forgotten or are only now rediscovering through neuroscience? That's what we're going to map in detail. And the first stop is a place most people associate with relaxation and flexibility, but which was originally designed for something far more radical. There is a reason why every tradition that produced genuinely transformed human beings built its entire pedagogy around practice rather than doctrine. Not because ideas are unimportant, but because ideas without the anchor of repeated embodied action remain permanently suspended in the atmosphere of intention, beautiful, inspiring, and ultimately inert. What follows is a mapping of 6 specific dimensions of this ancient understanding, each one illuminating a different facet of why disciplined practice is not a supplement to transformation, but its very engine. The first dimension is what we might call the betrayal of the thinking mind. Most people who pursue spiritual development or personal transformation begin with a sincere and reasonable assumption that if they can just understand something deeply enough, feel it genuinely enough, believe it completely enough, the change will follow naturally. This assumption is not only wrong, it is precisely backwards. And the reason it's backwards is not philosophical but neurological. Though the ancients described the same reality in different language, the human nervous system does not change in response to thoughts. It changes in response to repeated experience. When you think a new thought, even a profound and genuinely transformative one, you activate a pattern of neural firing that exists temporarily, like a spark in dry grass. When you perform a new action repeatedly, you begin to physically restructure the neural architecture of your brain and nervous system through a process neuroscientists call myelination. It is the gradual insulation of neural pathways that makes certain responses faster, more automatic, and more energetically efficient. In plain terms, thinking about courage doesn't make you courageous. Acting courageously, repeatedly, in small and large ways, gradually makes courage your default response to threat. The Stoics understood this with extraordinary precision. Epictetus, who was himself a former slave and one of the most psychologically rigorous philosophers of the ancient world, never taught his students to simply think differently. He prescribed specific daily practices, morning reflections done in writing, evening reviews of every action taken during the day, physical exercises, involuntary discomfort, deliberate exposure to difficult situations, precisely because he understood that philosophy without practice is not philosophy at all, it is entertainment. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who was Epictetus' most famous intellectual descendant, wrote his Meditations not as a book for public consumption, but as a daily practice of self-examination, a habit of returning again and again to the same principles until they ceased to be ideas and became reflexes. Here is the practice hidden inside this understanding. Notice, for the next week, the gap between what you believe and how you act, not as self-criticism, but as data. Every moment where your behavior contradicts your stated values is not evidence of moral failure. It is evidence that the behavior has been practiced longer than the value. In the original Vedic tantric understanding, the body is not the prison of the spirit. It is the most refined instrument available to the spirit for its work in the material world. The physical body, the pranamaya kosha or energy body, and the manomaya kosha or mental body are understood as nested sheaths of a single integrated system, and working on any one of them affects all the others. This is not mysticism. This is a sophisticated systems understanding of human psychology that modern somatic therapy, polyvagal theory, and embodied cognition research are only now beginning to confirm. Yoga, in its original and complete form, was not designed to make you flexible or relaxed. The asanas, the physical postures that the Western world has largely reduced yoga to, were specifically designed as preparation for the deeper practices of pranayama, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, breath regulation, concentration, meditation, and absorption. You are building what the traditions call tapas, which translates roughly as heat or austerity, but which functionally means the accumulated energy of consistent discipline. Every day you show up when you don't want to, you deposit something into an account that the ancients called will, and that neuroscience calls executive function. Both are pointing at the same reality. The third dimension takes us into territory that most modern people find genuinely strange, and it involves a man named George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, Gurdjieff was perhaps the most radical and uncompromising teacher of inner development the 20th century produced. Born in the Caucasus region in the 1870s, he spent decades traveling through Central Asia, Egypt, Persia, and Tibet, studying with masters of various traditions, before synthesizing what he learned into a system he called the work, or more formally, the Fourth Way. And at the absolute center of his teaching was an idea that was simultaneously obvious and deeply shocking, that human beings in their ordinary state are not conscious, they are asleep. They operate almost entirely on mechanical habit, automatic reaction, and unconscious repetition, while believing themselves to be awake, free, and self-directed. What made Gurdjieff's approach distinctive was his insistence that this mechanical sleep could not be interrupted by meditation, prayer, or intellectual study alone. It required what he called conscious labor and intentional suffering, which in practice meant the deliberate undertaking of difficult physical tasks performed with specific quality of attention. At his Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, established at the Château du Prieuré near Fontainebleau in France, students were required to perform grueling physical labor, construction work, farming, digging, carrying, not as punishment but as a precise technology for developing presence. The difficulty of the physical work made it impossible to drift into mental abstraction, and in that impossibility, in that forced return to the present moment through the demands of the body, Gurdjieff saw the possibility of genuine waking. He also developed an extraordinary series of sacred dances, which he called movements, that required simultaneous attention to precise physical positions, rhythmic counting, breathing patterns, and inner observation. The complexity was intentional. It was specifically designed to overwhelm the ordinary automatic mind, to create what he called super efforts, moments where the mechanical self runs out of capacity and something else, something more essential is forced to the surface. The insight encoded in Gurdjieff's system is one that modern habit science confirms from a completely different angle. The default human condition is automaticity. We are, in our ordinary functioning, habit machines. And while James Clear's Atomic Habits framework uses this reality constructively, building good automatic behaviors to replace bad ones, Gurdjieff's approach went further. He wanted to interrupt automaticity itself, to create moments of genuine conscious presence within the stream of mechanical life. The physical practices were the technology for doing this, because the body, when sufficiently challenged, cannot pretend to be somewhere else. Here is what this means practically. If you want to develop genuine self-awareness, and not just the pleasant feeling of self-awareness that comes from reading about self-awareness, you need practices that are difficult enough to demand your full attention. This is why the great traditions universally prescribe fasting, vigils, physical austerities, complex rituals, and demanding physical disciplines, not as ends in themselves, but as instruments for developing the quality of attention that is the prerequisite for everything else. You are practicing quite literally the capacity to be present, and presence, like any other capacity, only develops through training. The fourth dimension brings us to the monastery and to a technology for transformation so elegant and so precisely understood that it has been operating with essentially the same structure for 15 centuries. When Saint Benedict of Nursia wrote his rule in the 6th century, creating the framework for Western Christian monasticism, he was doing something that looked, on the surface, like organizational administration. He was prescribing schedules, dividing the day into periods of prayer, work, and study, regulating sleep, meals, silence, and communal life. But what he was actually doing, understood from the perspective of behavioral science and contemplative psychology, was designing a complete habit architecture for the transformation of a human being. The Benedictine day was structured around the divine office, 8 periods of communal prayer distributed across the 24 hours, including one in the middle of the night. This was not merely devotional, it was a precise technology for what modern habit researchers call habit stacking and environmental design, the deliberate structuring of time and context so that desired behaviors become the path of least resistance and undesired behaviors become structurally difficult. The monk didn't need willpower to pray 7 times a day. The entire environment, the bell, the community, the schedule, the architecture of the monastery itself was designed to make prayer automatic and deviation from prayer unusual. This is exactly what James Clear identifies as one of the most powerful mechanisms of habit formation. Design your environment so that the cue for the desired behavior is impossible to ignore and the cue for the undesired behavior is as absent as possible. The monastery was, in essence, a total environment designed for a specific transformation. Every element of daily life, from when you woke to what you ate to how you moved through physical space, was aligned with a single intention: the gradual conforming of the human will to a deeper pattern of being. Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk and one of the most articulate voices of 20th century contemplative life, described this structure not as restriction but as liberation. The paradox of monastic discipline, he argued, is that by eliminating the endless petty decisions of ordinary life, by removing the noise of constant choice, it creates a quality of interior silence and spaciousness that is simply not available to a person whose attention is perpetually fragmented by the demands of unstructured time. The habits hold the container, and within that container something else becomes possible. The practical implication is this: if you are serious about transformation, the most important thing you can do is not find the right motivation or the right understanding. It is to design your environment. Look at the physical spaces where you spend your time and ask honestly, does this environment support the person I am trying to become, or does it make that person structurally difficult to inhabit? This is not a metaphorical question, it is an architectural one. The fifth dimension crosses into territory that connects ancient Sufi practice with modern neuroscience in a way that is, once you see it, impossible to unsee. The Sufi orders of Islam developed one of the most sophisticated psychological technologies for inner transformation ever created, and at its center was a practice called dhikr, the rhythmic repetition of sacred phrases or names of the divine, performed with the breath, with movement, with the whole body engaged. The whirling of the Mevlevi dervishes, which the Western world tends to treat as a colorful cultural spectacle, was in fact a precisely calibrated practice designed to induce specific states of consciousness through the combination of rhythmic movement, breath, and concentrated attention. Rumi, the great poet of the Mevlevi order, described this not as entertainment but as annihilation, the dissolution of the ordinary egoic self in the fire of repeated practice until something more essential remains. What neuroscience has discovered about rhythmic repetitive practice illuminates why these methods were so universally adopted across traditions that had no contact with each other. Rhythmic repetition, whether in the form of chanting, walking meditation, prayer beads, ritual movement, or the repetitive physical labor of monastic life, activates the default mode network of the brain in a specific way that reduces the noise of discursive thought and creates what researchers call transient hypofrontality, a temporary reduction in the activity of the prefrontal cortex, the seat of self-referential thinking, and what we ordinarily call the ego. In plain terms, the rhythm takes over, and the part of you that is constantly narrating, judging, planning, and worrying gets temporarily quiet. And in that quiet, something else becomes accessible. Every tradition that used repetitive practice understood this intuitively. The Buddhist practice of Kinhin walking meditation uses the rhythm of footsteps as an anchor for attention. The Jewish tradition of davening, the rhythmic swaying during prayer, serves the same function. Notice the breath while you breathe deliberately. Feel the ground while you walk with intention. The practice is the vehicle. Your presence is the fuel. The sixth and final dimension of this mapping brings everything together in a synthesis that the Hermetic tradition captured in a single phrase that has been encoded into Western esoteric thought for centuries: solve et coagula. Dissolve and coagulate, break down and rebuild, and it is here that the atomic habit framework reveals its deepest dimension. James Clear's most important insight is not actually about habits, it is about identity. His central argument is that lasting behavioral change is not the result of motivation, or willpower, or even good strategy. It is the result of a fundamental shift in how you understand who you are. Every action you take is a vote for a particular identity, he argues. The Vedantic tradition describes this process as the movement from the gross body to the subtle, from the outer layers of conditioned existence inward toward what they call the Atman, the Atman-soul self. But crucially, this movement is never described as an escape from the body or from practice. It moves through the body, through the disciplined engagement with physical, energetic, and mental practices, not around them. The body is not the obstacle to transformation, it is the path. And here is where the Atomic Habit Framework becomes not just a productivity tool, but a genuine technology of inner development. When you understand that each small practice is not merely building a skill or a behavior, but literally casting a vote for a new identity. When you understand that the consistency of small actions over time is precisely what the great traditions meant by tapas, by ascesis, by conscious labor, then the question of what habits to build becomes a genuinely sacred question. And what every single one of these traditions and discoveries points toward is a conclusion so simple it sounds almost insulting until you sit with its full weight. You are not who you think you are. You are what you repeatedly do. But now, let's take that one step further, because this is where it gets genuinely strange. If identity is built through repeated action, and if every tradition that produced transforms human beings understood this, then what does it mean that the dominant spiritual culture of the modern West has organized itself almost entirely around the experience of insight, around the feeling of understanding, around the consumption of ideas about transformation rather than the practice of it? What does it mean that millions of people can describe with genuine eloquence and apparent sincerity the nature of consciousness, the mechanics of manifestation, the structure of the ego and its dissolution, while their actual daily behavior, their actual nervous system, their actual patterns of reaction and response remain essentially unchanged? It means something that Gurdjieff said with characteristic bluntness, and that every honest contemplative tradition has acknowledged in its own way: the spiritual seeker who accumulates knowledge without practice is not progressing. They are building a more elaborate and more comfortable prison. The ideas become the entertainment, the insights become the substitute for the work. And the tragedy, the genuine tragedy, is that it feels like development. It produces the sensation of growth without the substance of it. The riverbank, in other words, can become so interesting, so richly decorated with beautiful maps and descriptions of the water that a person spends an entire lifetime there without ever getting wet. This is the phenomenon that the great traditions called spiritual bypassing before the modern psychologist John Wellwood gave it that name in the 1980s. The use of spiritual ideas and practices, but notice, practices done without genuine engagement, performed mechanically or symbolically, to avoid rather than confront the actual work of transformation. The Zen masters had a term for the person who had accumulated vast spiritual knowledge without genuine practice. They called it stinking of Zen. All the language, all the concepts, all the sophisticated understanding, and underneath it, the same unexamined patterns, the same unworked fears, the same mechanical reactivity, now simply wearing more elegant clothing. What makes this genuinely vertiginous, what creates the real philosophical vertigo here, is the implication for everything you believe about your own development. Consider the possibility, consider it seriously, that the measure of your actual spiritual progress is not the sophistication of your understanding, not the beauty of your beliefs, not the coherence of your philosophy, but the concrete specificity of your daily practices. What do you actually do every day with your body, with your attention, with your time, that is different from what you did 5 years ago? Not what do you think or believe or understand, but what do you do? The ancient Indian concept of Kriya, sacred action, pointed at precisely this. Not sacred in the sense of religiously significant, but sacred in the sense of intentional, conscious, transformative. Every action performed with full presence and clear intention is a Kriya. Every action performed mechanically, however spiritually themed, is simply more conditioning. The difference between transformation and spiritual entertainment is not in the content of the practice, but in the quality of presence brought to it. And here is the synthesis that brings every thread of this conversation together into a single coherent image. The concept of atomic habits, understood at its full depths, is not a productivity framework, it is a cosmological statement. It is saying that reality, including the reality of who you are, is not made of grand gestures and dramatic revelations. It is made of atoms, of irreducibly small, consistent, repeated actions. And just as physical matter emerges from the behavior of particles too small to see, identity, character, and what the traditions call the soul emerge from the behavior of habits too small to feel significant in any individual moment. This is what the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, means when applied to human development. The macrocosm of who you become over a lifetime is built from the microcosm of what you do each morning. The grand spiritual transformation that every seeker dreams of is not a lightning bolt from the sky. It is the slow, patient, almost invisible accumulation of small practices, each one depositing something into the account of who you are becoming, each one casting a vote, as Clear says, for a particular identity, until one day, not with drama but with quiet certainty, you realize that the person performing the practice is not the same person who began it. Something has actually changed, not in your ideas about yourself, in yourself. The desert fathers of early Christian monasticism, those radical hermits who retreated to the Egyptian and Syrian deserts in the 3rd and 4th centuries to pursue transformation with terrifying seriousness, had a concept they called apatheia, which has nothing to do with the English word apathy. It meant the condition of a person whose passions, whose automatic emotional reaction had been so thoroughly worked with through years of ascetic practice that they no longer controlled his behavior, not suppressed, not denied, but genuinely transformed through practice into something that served rather than enslaved. This was considered the foundation, not the peak of the contemplative life, the foundation. And it was understood to require, typically, decades of consistent daily practice to approach We live in a culture that expects transformation in a weekend workshop, that markets enlightenment in a 10-day retreat, that sells the feeling of breakthrough as if the feeling were the thing itself. And perhaps the deepest service that the Atomic Habits framework performs, when understood in this full context, is to reintroduce a sense of honest timescale. Real change is slow. Real change isn't glamorous. Real change happens in the 10,000th repetition of a small practice, not in the first inspired encounter with a beautiful idea. The mystics knew this. The monks knew this. Gurdjieff's exhausted students, digging in the cold at 5 in the morning while their teacher watched with inscrutable attention, knew this in their bodies, if not yet in their minds. So what does this mean for you specifically today? It means that the most revolutionary thing you can do is not find a better philosophy. It is to start a practice. One practice, small enough to be genuinely sustainable, specific enough to be unambiguous, physical enough to anchor it in the body where transformation actually happens. Poof, and then return to it every day, not because every day feels significant, because most days won't, but because you understand now what the accumulated weight of return actually builds. You are not just building a habit, you are building a self. You are casting votes, one small action at a time, for the person you are in the process of becoming. And unlike thoughts, which are weightless and vanish without trace, each action leaves a mark, each repetition deepens the groove. Each return, however reluctant, however imperfect, is a genuine deposit into the only account that ultimately matters. The Upanishads say, "You are what your deepest desire is. As your desire is, so is your intention. As your intention is, so is your will. As your will is, so is your deed. As your deed is, so is your destiny." Notice the sequence. It does not end with desire. It does not end with intention. It ends with deed, with action. Primited, accumulated, embodied practice of living in the direction of what you most deeply are. And so we arrive at the question that this entire journey has been building toward. The question that doesn't resolve into an answer but opens into a life. If you stripped away every idea you have about your own spiritual development, every book you've read, every insight you've had, every moment of inspiration and understanding, and looked only at your actual daily practices, what story would they tell about who you are actually becoming? Not who you intend to become, not who you believe yourself to be, not who you feel like in your best moments of inspired understanding, but who the accumulated weight of your repeated daily actions is, quietly and without commentary, building you into. That question is not meant to produce guilt. Guilt is another form of mental entertainment, another way of feeling something without changing anything. It is meant to produce clarity. If these ideas resonate with something in you, something deeper than intellectual agreement, consider subscribing to this channel. Not because there are answers waiting here, but because this is a space dedicated to taking the questions seriously enough to keep returning to them, to keep hunting. The mystery, after all, is not something you solve, it is something you practice your way into. The hunt continues,